On war, globalization, and terror. We're getting toward the end here. We have, I think, 3 or 4 more classes left. We're going to continue doing the Middle East, which we started last week. And then there's going to be a little administrative shift. The next class after this is actually going to be James talking about Vietnam. It was James Carter, graduate student working with me. So he's going to do the Vietnam lecture. I don't have to. So that will be next, and then I'll pick up from where I left off today next week. So don't worry about it. It'll be seamless, but just to kind of keep that in mind. All right. Last week I began, we were talking about the American foreign policy in the 50s, which kind of has this dual approach. On one hand, Eisenhower is going to spend a lot more money on the Air Force so that it can use massive retaliation, which is the buzzword at the time, against enemies, including possibly retaliatory nuclear weapons. However, that's, as we'll see, not really a reasonable policy in a lot of ways, because it doesn't leave you with graduated options. You know, what are you going to do? You know, use an atomic bomb every time somebody does something you don't like? So what you see then, on one hand, you have massive retaliations, the new look, but on the other hand, what you see in reality is covert operations, and we've used a couple examples of that already, in particular the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala, and then we had just finished the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, and I was from there starting to talk a little bit about Nasser, and I want to start there again because that's fairly important. Nasser is not terribly well known today in the West. I think the history of Nasserism really isn't well known, but especially because the Middle East has become so important in the past decade or so, it's really vital to understand this, because Nasser is an incredibly important force there, much like Mao Zedong would be in the 40s and 50s, you know, in the Third World. I mean, Nasser was really at that level as a really important figure. So I want to start and, you know, talk about that again some more and spend a little time on it, because I think it's really important. There are various roots to the current crisis in the Middle East, and Nasserism, you know, certainly is one of them. Nasser actually came to power with some U.S. support. He had overthrown a monarchy led by King Farouk in the early 50s. The U.S. at the time was in this period of what we often refer to as modernization. It was promoting modernization, development. The idea there is that these countries, which the U.S. has a great deal of influence in, countries which potentially have incredible resources, especially in the Middle East to have oil, aren't really using their resources properly. They're not modernized. They're feudal, or they're run by, you know, kind of a family dictatorship. The people don't enjoy political privileges. There's not kind of a decent educational system. There's not a decent infrastructure. And this goes back to the stuff we talked about the first day with liberal imperialism, the imperialism of idealism. If you want to have real opportunities for power and wealth in a particular society, that society really does have to develop and grow. And so Nasser was seen as an agent of modernization. The idea there is that he's going to get away from this kind of old feudal system, you know, King Farouk, and he will modernize Egypt, thereby making it an important commercial nation in the global political economy. As with Iran, the U.S. saw in Egypt an opportunity to displace British influence. It's ironic, isn't it, because the Cold War is supposed to be about the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and clearly it is. But at the same time, we keep seeing this U.S.-British conflict emerging because, you know, Britain still has these remnants of the empire, and the United States, remember, continually is trying to disrupt that, break it apart. Why? Why does the U.S. want to break apart the British Empire? It's a closed trading system, right? So the U.S. wants access to that. So Nasser actually does go to the British and say, you know, look, we're not going to be a British colony anymore. We're tired of this dependency. He demands that Britain abandon military bases that it had along the Suez Canal, and Britain agrees to a phased withdrawal. So this is really kind of the way modernization is supposed to work. Nasser also, however, believed in neutrality internationally. There was and I briefly mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, in the 50s there was emerging kind of a third world neutrality movement. The countries of the Third World were kind of tired of having to choose between the major powers in the Cold War, either to be, allied to the United States or allied to the Soviet Union and the communists. So a lot of these countries wanted a neutral path, a third way. This is where the phrase Third World comes from. And in fact, in 1955, they had a major conference at Indonesia at a place called Bandung. And Nasser and Sukarno from Indonesia and Nehru from India were kind of the major driving forces behind this. It was also referred to as the non-aligned movement. And the idea there was that they could have a positive neutrality. The countries that weren't in the Soviet or American camp could work with both of these countries, trade with them, find commercial opportunities there, but not be, kind of a client state or a puppet state. They didn't want to be part of either the American camp or the Soviet camp. So Nasser is really a driving force on that. And especially for the Arab Third World, he is a real icon, kind of a George Washington figure, to use an American metaphor, or like Mao Zedong. I mean, Nasser he's the guy, he's the bomb, because this is the guy who's going to take the Middle East into the next level, to the modern world. And I think for a lot of, especially, kind of younger Arab politically inclined Arabs, I mean, Nasser, and I think Mossadegh had that role before him, really is an icon and remains so today. I think Nasserism, and Nasserism was basically secular. It wasn't Islamic. However, I mean, I think it still is an incredibly potent force, because we'll see, Nasser's the guy who stands up to the West. Nasser's the guy who tries to modernize Egypt. And in the entire Third World, he is seen really as a beacon, as an icon. The United States has real issues with that. See, in the Cold War, the U.S. views neutrality as opposition. Neutralism or any kind of, failure to line up very clearly with the United States raises suspicions. In the Cold War, America bases its allies on a country's response to American military and economic influence. If a country allows American investors in, if a country accepts American military aid or American military training, if a country serves as a proxy for the United States, like Castillo Armas in Guatemala would after the coup, or like the Shah would after the coup, then the way those countries are constituted internally doesn't really matter that much. Despite the rhetoric, of creating democracy, as we've seen time and again, that's not really a consideration, especially in Latin America. Look at, the kind of Trujillos and Somozas that the U.S. is supporting. Sure, they're sons of bitches, but there are sons of bitches. It's that idea. So people who don't fall in line, like Nasser, are viewed with suspicion. So on one hand, Nasser represents modernization, which is good, because Egypt has vast potential to be a major economic player in the Middle East. But at the same time, you can't really trust the guy, because he's a nationalist. And nationalism and neutralism are considered really dangerous. As a result of that, the U.S. actually creates an alliance in the Middle East to hedge against Arab nationalism. It's called the Baghdad Pact. And Turkey and Iran and Iraq, Pakistan and Britain are part of the Baghdad Pact. And it's not terribly important within the context of what we're doing to talk about this, but the reason I bring it up is that the Baghdad Pact, in a sense, is a response to Arab nationalism. It's a way of taking these Arab states, all of which are on very close terms to the U.S. Turkey, Iran has the Shah, Iraq, as we'll see, clearly, as part of the American sphere of interest in the Middle East. All of these countries, along with the British and the Americans, can kind of line up against these new forces of Nasserism or Arab nationalism. So the U.S. increasingly sees Nasser as a threat. All right. And again, I'm stressing this because, when you get up to 2001 or 2004, these ideas really do once more erupt, or 1979 during the hostage crisis, or, really you can pretty much pick a date out of the air, and you'll see that Nasserism and the kind of ideas represented there, and the analysis of what the Americans mean in the Middle East is still very much valid today. Nasser was not a communist, that's clear, and he was obviously labeled as such, but Nasser in fact outlawed the Communist Party in Egypt. He was no friend to the Egyptian communists, and that's clear. I mean, that's just basic evidence, you know. I mean, communists were jailed by Nasser. But he was also aware of what the United States had done in Iran in '53 and ousting Mossadegh. And he was also aware that the United States, and we'll talk about this later, was a major supporter of Israel, and that Israel was conducting raids along the Gaza Strip, which borders the two countries. And that, you know, the whole role of Israel in the Middle East can never be discounted. I mean, you can't really discuss the Middle East without talking about Israel. Only in the United States do you do that. It's the only place where we have these major discussions about the U.S. and Israel's just on the side, it's on the periphery, and nowhere else does that happen, especially in the Middle East, where every discussion about American policy begins with American support of Israel. And it was with Nasser, who saw the Americans sending billions of dollars of aid, development and military to Israel, and so this frightens him, especially when Israel conducts what he considers aggressive actions in his territory. So Nasser is quite upset. He said of the Baghdad Pact, all this hammering and hammering and hammering for pacts only keeps alive old suspicions about Western imperialism in the Arab world. The more you do this, the more you have these alliances against us, the more you overthrow governments which don't do what you want them to do, the more you continue to support Israel, then we will continue to be suspicious of your overall motives and what you plan to do in this region. As a result of that, Egypt begins to look for aid, for help, for allies, signs agreements with Syria and Saudi Arabia, and also, shades of Arbenz, purchases weapons from Czechoslovakia in exchange for cotton. Now, Egypt does have, you know, kind of leverage in that sense. It's a big country. It has Suez. It has cotton. Nasser was not a Russian client. He wasn't a puppet. And in fact, the deal he made, the cotton for arms deal, was favorable to Egypt. But for the United States, that doesn't matter. I mean, the U.S. begins to link Nasser and Khrushchev, you know, Soviet-Egyptian ambition, Soviet-Egyptian aggression in the Middle East, you know, Egyptian communism, you know, that kind of stuff. And it's really hysterical. And basically the point here is that nationalism, and this is what Nasser represents, Middle Eastern nationalism. He believes in kind of pan-Arab unity, that the Arabs need to work together, all right? This is kind of sticky because remember right before World War II, we were very critical of what the Japanese were trying to do. The Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, right? Which was really an imperial agenda to take over, you know, Asia with Japan in control. But then we've talked about Pan-Americanism and, you know, what did the other Latin countries say about that? They were very critical of the U.S., right? Their conception of Pan-Americanism was quite different than the American conception of Pan-Americanism, which included the U.S. as hegemon under the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt Corollary. And the Latin countries didn't believe that Pan-Americanism would allow something like the Roosevelt Corollary or the Platt Amendment or all these interventions. Well, Nasser sees Pan-Arab unity, you know, not as a Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, but as a collection of Arab states working together. The basic argument behind Arab nationalism is we have incredible resources here. We have the resources here, especially oil, of course, which will enable us to be independent of the West. We don't need to be their dependents. We don't need to be their economic colonies any longer. We can take control of the resources we have, and we can put them to use. We can control our lands, we can control our waterways, we can control our oil, and in that way we can be an independent force in global politics, a third force, the third world. You know, third world has become synonymous with poverty and underdevelopment, but it doesn't need to be. It started as kind of an implication that there's a third way to do things, neither American nor neither capitalist nor communist, but you know, nationalist or neutral. So the United States is quite furious then because of this emerging Arab nationalism. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, even considers trying to get a coup against Nasser, you know, get rid of him like they had done against Mossadegh. That they didn't do that. I mean, you know, Nasser becomes such a figure, such an icon, that an American attempt to oust him would simply create huge problems throughout the third world. I mean, you know, the U.S. already is held in suspicion. Right? Most of the third world, the idea behind the United States when it acted internationally was always that it would be kind of a good example, that the globe would want to, other countries in the globe would want to be like the Americans, and that's true. I mean, if you look at the early writings of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, he uses the Americans as his icon. The Vietnamese Declaration of Independence in 1945 quotes from the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. However, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the U.S. is starting to lose that credibility. And now, when nationalist movements emerge, they don't look to Washington, D.C. for the example of what a nationalist can be. They tend to look at Jakarta or Beijing or Cairo, right? So this is of great concern to the Americans because they're using they're losing that mantle of credibility as an example to the rest of the world, on how to conduct yourself, on how to be a vibrant democracy. People aren't looking there. The kind of activists, the nationalist movements aren't looking to Washington any longer. They're looking at China and Egypt and Indonesia and places like that. And so the U.S. has to be careful. I mean, it can go in and overthrow a government. It did it in Guatemala. It did it in Tehran. It'll try to do it in Indonesia and Cuba and Chile and many other places. But there are risks associated with that. There are limits to American power. And a bold overthrow or a bold intervention against Nasser probably would have been, ridiculous. It would have been really, really a disaster because the entire Arab world would have seen that as heavy-handed, and the kind of whole "why do they hate us" thing would have emerged much earlier. So the U.S. doesn't try to do that, and in fact actually tries to bring Nasser in the way they know best, which is through economic inducements. Right? Remember what did William Howard Taft say? We will replace dollars. We will replace dollars for bullets. Right? I keep thinking there was an episode in the '80s of Miami Vice where Gordon Liddy was on as this kind of crackpot military guy. Can you imagine that? Gordon Liddy playing a crackpot who was down in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, but he had this speech which was very much like this, and he explained that in most of the world they use violence to get what they want, but here in America we use money, And so this is essentially what they're trying to do. They offer Nasser $1 billion to build an irrigation system at the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River. And this is part of modernization, right? Electrification, irrigation, energy. This is what a modern state does. The model here comes from the New Deal in the United States, which would be what? What did they do during the New Deal? What was the major development project for electricity, for energy, for the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? And in fact, the same people who worked on the TVA, David Lilienthal is actually a consultant in a lot of these Middle Eastern states as well as in South Vietnam to try to get these countries to modernize as well. But remember, what did we say last week? Instead of modernization, what does the third world get? Guns, right? That becomes the substitute because modernization is sticky because it implies all kinds of political, issues like democracy that the U.S. doesn't really want to deal with, all right? So they do throw this carrot out. We'll give you $1 billion to build the Aswan High Dam. And the implication there is that if Nasser does this, then he will be far more friendly, far more accommodating to American interests than to communist interests, right? This is America has two advantages in the Cold War, weapons and money. It's kind of hard to lose when it's structured that way. But the U.S. has a far greater military, establishment and a lot more money. And it also controls the major institutions of global economics like the IMF and the World Bank and the dollar is the global currency. So it's able to use that carrot. And so Nasser agrees to this deal. However, there are elements in the United States opposed to it. There is a significant Jewish lobby in the U.S. There are a lot of pro-Israel groups which don't want this level of money and modernization going to an Arab state. In addition to that, what is Egypt's major crop? What is their major commodity? Cotton. And a lot of people in the U.S. are opposed to helping Egypt. And who might that be? Southerners who are from cotton states, right? Louisiana, South Carolina, Texas, right? So there is opposition to helping Egypt out as well. And then, again, shades of Guatemala, Nasser recognizes the People's Republic of China. This is in 1956. When did Mao win the Civil War? 1949. 7 years later, Nasser says, yeah, you're the government there, right? And the U.S. is the only country, the U.S. is the last country to recognize the PRC. It waits till 1979 to do it. So when Nasser recognizes Mao Zedong as the leader of China, which is just a simple recognition of reality, the U.S. flips. And so Dulles withdraws this offer of $1 billion to build this high dam, thereby invoking one of my favorite quotes of all time from Nasser, "May you choke on your fury." Okay? Nasser was furious. U.S. policy intended to create modernization and create kind of an American allied state in Egypt has done what? It's done quite the opposite. It's infuriated the leader of Egypt, and in addition to that, what message does it send throughout the Arab world, indeed throughout the entire third world? You do what we tell you, and if not, we'll use whatever levers we have, and in this case, we're not going to give you $1 billion. So what does Nasser do? See, again, Nasser has leverages that Arbenz never had and that Mossadegh was unwilling to use. But what does Nasser do? What is Nasser's trump card, so to speak? Suez, the Suez Canal. I forgot to get a map just of Suez, but there's Egypt there, okay? In July of 1956, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal Company was owned by the British and the French, all right? And they were getting about $100 million a year out of Suez, out of duties from traveling along, through the Suez Canal. So Nasser says, I'm going to nationalize Suez, and I'm going to take that money and keep it here in Egypt, that $100 million a year, and I'm going to build my own dam. I don't need American money. I don't need Western charity to build a dam. We can do it here. Nasser's stature at that moment just mushroomed. It erupted. This guy was taking on the Americans, the British, the French, the IMF, the British Empire, everybody. This guy was, he was like, winning 7 gold medals at the Olympics or something like that. And, Nasser in the Third World was just, amazing. He had closed off. And Suez isn't just some little trickle. Suez is vital for both commercial and military transshipments, for oil and for Western military needs. So, Nasser had really, kind of pulled out his trump card and really kind of, in a sense, strangled the West in a very vital area. Dulles and others wanted to use force. They wanted to go in against Nasser. They wanted to use military intervention. Cooler heads prevailed. Eisenhower and others understood that if the U.S. used force at Suez, then the entire Arab world would essentially be lost for a long time, if not forever. And the Soviet Union would be the beneficiaries of it, right? The U.S. would be the heavy-handed Western country coming in, and the Soviet Union will be seen as, kind of the liberators, the supporters of the Third World. So Eisenhower, rejects intervention, but in London and Paris, there's a different vibe going on. And so the British and the French, along with, who would be the third country involved in this? Israel, decide to intervene. And they begin preparations for a secret military attack. And in late October of 1929, Israel strikes first, going across the Sinai and advancing towards Suez. And Britain and France demanded that Nasser withdraw from Suez within, like a 12-hour period. Nasser says no, and British and French bombers begin to attack Egyptian airfields and send an armada toward the canal, all right? This is big stuff. This is, imagine the British and French are now using airplanes to bomb Egypt, and they're sending an armada toward the canal. Nasser scuttled that by scuttling 50 ships. He scuttled 50 ships, so the British and the French couldn't get there. But still, this is looking ugly. You can imagine this is a global crisis. The Western powers are acting against this major Arab state whose leader has incredible props throughout the entire Third World. Eisenhower and Dulles, ironically, were furious at London and Paris and Israel, and because it had been such a disaster. The raids didn't go well. The entire world was condemning the Westerners. And Eisenhower and Dulles just said, you guys have played into the Soviet Union's hands. And in addition to that, you are, putting at risk this vital area of commercial, transport, Suez and the Mediterranean. We need this for oil, and we need it for military maneuvers as well. So Eisenhower and Dulles were furious. These guys, Eisenhower and Dulles, they're kind of liberal imperialists. And they don't like Nasser, and Dulles especially would get rid of him in a minute if he could. But they also understand that, in the 19th century, you might be able to send an armada in and get your way, but it's much more difficult to do that. And the risks are far greater. And in the long term, it's better to have some kind of commercial intercourse between states rather than to use this kind of coercive power. The U.S. actually goes to the United Nations to get them to condemn the British-French-Israel attacks. Dulles even says that if the attacks go on, I fear that this UN charter will be torn into shreds, and the world again will be in a world of anarchy. This is John Foster Dulles. I mean, even Dulles gets it. The peril of intervening in the Middle East. John Foster Dulles, the consummate Cold Warrior, gets it. I mean, compare that to what you would hear, Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz saying in the past couple years. And I mean, these guys got nothing on Dulles, but he understood that there were incredible perils involved in using this kind of force against the Egyptians. Dulles says, unless the U.S. acts to stop this attack, it will be looked upon as forever tied to British and French colonialist policies, and the countries of the Third World will turn from us to the USSR. So again, he's aware of the risks involved in that. Finally, the British and French have to pull back. Nasser had stood up to them, and the Americans had broken with their major allies. It's a huge victory in the Third World. It's a huge victory for Arab nationalism. And again, I mean, it's the kind of thing that would often come up. Arab nationalists, I mean, from that point on, are aware of Nasser and aware of Nasserism and aware of this legacy, which is really vital. I mean, I can't think of a good comparison. Occasionally you'll meet, like a Southerner who will invoke particular icons of Southern history. And it's very powerful. And I mean, in the Arab world, I mean, Suez is very powerful. You will see references to Suez all the time from, I mean, we've, had people here speaking, scholars and professors who still, 2002 would talk about Suez and how important that was in the history of the region. The U.S. finds itself in something of a quandary. I mean, it's clearly not going to cut and run. That region is just far too important because of oil, because of petroleum, because of, access. But it can't continue doing things in a heavy-handed way, and it wants to stop communism in the region. Therefore, the president announces his approach. He calls it the Eisenhower Doctrine. In 1957, in the aftermath of Suez, the United States is deeply concerned, as it says, that the loss of the area would be disastrous because of the oil requirements. I mean, they're very candid about the need for oil. So the United States, Eisenhower in early 57 speaks to Congress and asks that Congress give him the authority to use American armed forces in the Middle East to defend or to help any country against overt armed aggression by communists, all right? So it's kind of like the Monroe Doctrine for the Middle East. This time, it's saying, if communists intervene in the Middle East, then the United States will take action against them, right? In addition to that, Eisenhower says, we will give aid to friendly countries in that region. Eisenhower says, Russia's rulers have long sought to dominate the Middle East, while the Americans have never for a moment entertained an aggressive thought about the region. Yeah.
So is the key difference between that and the Truman Doctrine?
Yeah, I mean, Truman was about, I mean, these things are specific so that a particular amount of money or troops can be deployed to a particular region. I mean, as you know, the Eisenhower Doctrine will be invoked in Lebanon, which is an area that was never of really any concern to the United States. So the Truman Doctrine is talking about the Balkans, Greece and Turkey, which is a fairly important area. And then NSC 68 says, well, everywhere is important. And, you know, the Eisenhower Doctrine is a statement. It's not a law. No, it's a statement. It's Eisenhower's policy. You know, a doctrine is a policy. So what he's saying is the Middle East is now part of this. The Middle East is important enough that we can specifically and separately include that in our sphere of influence as an area where we will, you know, use force to harm our enemies and use money to help our friends. Yeah.
Well, this one, you just said that we keep communism out of there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't communism that was really attacking them.
No. I mean, that's a good point. The point is they're always going to use communism as the red herring, right? I mean, if he says we're going to use our power to stop nationalist forces, I mean, you can't get away with that in the third world, right? Yeah, so you need to use communism. Yeah, I mean, the idea of Egypt being a communist bastion was ridiculous, just as it was in Iran or in Guatemala. You know, even if it had been, and I say that as a historian, because the idea there is that so many people say, well, they weren't communists, so it was wrong. Well, even if they had been communists, that doesn't, you know, legitimate intervention, right? I mean, these were legitimate governments. You know, Nasser, even though he came to power via a coup, I mean, clearly it was a modern state. You know, and Arbenz and Mossadegh had been elected. So the idea there is, yeah, but the U.S. has to use communism. You see this throughout the Cold War. It's neutralism or nationalism. You know, it's the duck test. Remember, if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck and tastes like a duck, then it's a duck. So they may call themselves nationalist or neutralist, but if they take aid from the Soviet Union, and if they try to, you know, close off waterways or take over oil revenues or take UFCO land, then they may call themselves neutral or nationalist, but in fact we know what they really are, and what they really are communists, because this is what communists do. And communists don't come out and call themselves communists. They're deceptive and they're tricky. So they pretend they're not communists, and that's almost proof. It's like the Salem witch trials, right? If you admit you're a witch, they drown you. And if you say you're not a witch, you're still a witch, because witches lie, right? So if you call yourself a communist, then, you know, you're a communist. But if you say you're not, I'm a nationalist, then you are too, because you're deceptive, right? So either way, it justifies this intervention. But the real test is the accommodation that these states make to American capital, to American investment, to American trade. And basically, if those states are not open to kind of, you know, uninhibited commerce and investment and trade and, you know, resource expropriation, then they're commies. It's just much easier to define it that way, because it gives you incredible leverage in going in and kind of doing what you need to do. It's an attack on Arab nationalism, more than even bigger. It's bigger than that. I mean, it's clearly an attack on Nasser. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the Eisenhower Doctrine responds to him. But more than that, it's an attack, if you want to use that phrase, or it's a response to Arab nationalism, to everybody in the third world who says we want to go a different way. And what the U.S. is saying is that, you know, be alert, because we reserve the right we reserve the right to refuse service to you, basically. If we don't like what you're saying, we don't like what you're doing, then we have the capacity and we reserve the right to go in and change things, or to do what we can do or what we have to do. So, I mean, it's definitely directed at it's a response to Suez, there's no question about that, but it's bigger than that. I mean, and we're going to see it in Vietnam, you'll see it in Indonesia, you'll see it in Cuba, you see it, you know, in Chile. I mean, just in many places, this is the basic attitude. There are communists there. And if there are communists there, then it's our duty, not just our right, it's our duty to do something about it. You see this at home as well, in the unions, or among African-American leaders like Paul Robeson, or if a woman wants to continue to stay in the factory and work when everyone else is telling her to go home and move to the suburbs and have babies. I mean, this idea of using this communist card is incredibly powerful. I mean, it's, you know, we're not aware of that anymore. It's outdated. But, you know, think of calling somebody a terrorist, right? I mean, it's still very powerful. It's, you know, we were talking about that. I was on the Connection yesterday, and the guy called me Hanoi Jane, right? And that's not terribly powerful anymore. But there was a time when you could really discredit somebody that way. Oh, you're just like Jane Fonda. You're a traitor. You're supporting the enemy, you know? And so this idea is really powerful. If Eisenhower says, you know, we're going to stop communism, then who's going to disagree with that? You know, if you stand up and say, well, I think that's a bad idea, then you're a commie, right? So it's incredibly potent. I mean, it seems it's more difficult to understand now. 15 years ago, I would have said that. You would have said, oh, yeah, of course, because, you know, you could still use that. You still had, you know, throughout the entire Vietnam War, LBJ was calling the anti-war movement communist dominated, right? And these are like, you know, old, I mean, if you saw the movement, you know, the last thing the commies would want to deal with would be people like that, you know, I mean, ministers and, you know, hippies and stuff like that. But it's a powerful force. You know, Newt Gingrich was saying that, remember, into the late 80s and 90s, the communist this and the communist that. So, no, I mean, it's not aimed at communism in the Middle East. Communism has never been, it's always been difficult in the Middle East. It never took root there. I mean, there were clearly leftist-inspired movements, but the one thing that always worked in the Middle East was always Islam, far more than communism. And basically, every time there was a movement that had kind of a leftist element, like the Mujahideen in Iran, the Muslims essentially superseded that, because that's an incredibly potent historical force there, far more than Marxism ever could be in that region. So, yeah, long answer, but a really good question, a really good point. So, I mean, the Americans could not point to any specific communist deeds or you know, anything like that. But all you needed was allegations. You needed no evidence. You know, in fact, as I said, Nasser, using Egypt as an example, had outlawed the Communist Party and jailed a bunch of its leaders. Right? Still, you know, Eisenhower asks Congress to give him the authority to intervene because there are communists there. Right? And he said, you know, as I said, Russia's rulers have long tried to dominate this region, while Americans have never for a moment entertained an aggressive thought. You know, this is what he says. And, you know, this is the point at which, you know, everybody listening to that should, you know, kind of, in Hollywood, they would all blurt their coffee out, you know, like one of those scenes where everybody spills their coffee out because what they've just heard is so ridiculous. But that's not what happens. That's not what happens. So, in the United States, then, you know, they've reserved the right to continue to have their way in the Middle East. In the Arab world, it creates problems. I mean, even in Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud there, the ruling family, shares America's concern about Nasserism. And this is something that's really important to understand, because you can't look at the Middle East as some kind of homogenous region where everybody thinks alike. All right. Not only is Nasserism a threat to the West, but it's also a threat to a lot of the established monarchies in the Arab world. Okay? The House of Saud in Saudi Arabia sees Nasserism a threat. Do the Saudi rulers want their people to have the same ideas that the Egyptians do about nationalism, about control of resources? See, Nasserism's not just about we want the British and French out, it's about we want a viable society here at home, a modern society where we have rights to education and to employment and things like that, all right? Now, that also means that you're assuming a level of kind of political consciousness and political engagement. Do you think the Saudi rulers want that? Do you think the House of Saud wants its people demanding, you know, education and political democracy and all kinds of stuff like that? No. So the Americans actually this is when the U.S. gets a lot of their base rights at places like Dhahran and elsewhere. In Jordan, King Hussein, who was always on very good terms, in fact married an American woman, in the 50s begins attacking communism, you know, making these speeches about how bad communism is in Jordan, where it really didn't exist, and becomes a good friend of the Americans. It gets millions of dollars in aid. In fact, after Eisenhower announces this Eisenhower Doctrine, the U.S. sends the 6th Fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean. Shortly after Suez, a Nasserite regime came to power in Syria. And so what did the U.S. do? The State Department, Dulles, says Syria has become or is about to become a base for military and subversive activities in the Near East designed to destroy the independence of those countries and to subject them to Soviet communist domination. This is really apocalyptic language about Syria, all right? The CIA plots an overthrow, but that's scuttled. Eisenhower and Dulles then use one of their allies, Turkey, to put pressure on Syria. They also bring in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. The American pressure, however, and I'm using this as an example, as the way this works, the American pressure instead galvanizes the Arabs, and Egypt and Syria actually joined together and formed something called the United Arab Republic, which outlawed the Communist Party at that point. So again, I mean, U.S. pressure forces this kind of anti-communist response. The biggest test, though, comes in 1958 in Lebanon. Lebanon is actually unique in the Middle East. Its political system is actually based on party association, a religious party association. So there are seats allocated for different groups. It's probably the most religiously diverse state in the entire region. So there's kind of a power sharing agreement among the various religious groups. The leader of Lebanon was a guy named Camille Chamoun, who was very closely tied to the U.S., but in the streets there were all kinds of anti-American rallies, which were kind of commonplace throughout the 50s, throughout the Middle East. Throughout many places, the U.S. has really seen. I mean, I won't even talk about something like Algeria, but there's an independence movement going on in Algeria in the late 50s as well, directed against the French. The film Battle of Algiers, which is really great, talks about this. But that, in the United States, you kind of get a glimpse of this. Oh, there's something going on in Algeria. Something's happening in Lebanon. But in the rest of the world, this is really kind of front and center. And so in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, politically conscious young people especially, trade unionists, socialists, communists, all of them are aware of what's going on. And they see this kind of global movement taking shape in places like Algeria or Lebanon or Syria or Egypt or in Cuba or Vietnam, China, Indonesia, India, right? So this is something big, and the Americans recognize that they're up against something big, that their own kind of control. It's still, I mean, they still have the money and the bullets, so they can kind of get their way. But at the same time, there is this kind of drift away from the American model, this drift away from using the Americans as the icon of how you want your society to be, on what a modern society should be. So in Lebanon becomes crucial in that regard. Chamoun is an American puppet as far as his people are concerned. They're in the streets demonstrating against the U.S., which is something you see all over the place. All right. Ultimately, the U.S., even though Chamoun is their guy in a sense, has to get rid of him and put somebody else in power. And how do they do this? They actually send Marines into Lebanon. 14,000 U.S. Marines stormed the beach. It's almost comical because, no one expected that. There were tourists on the beach. I mean, these are like literally vendors are selling hummus and people are playing with beach balls with their kids. And all of a sudden the Marines show up and they storm the beach. They basically help rig an election and Chamoun is ousted, but another safe candidate is put in power. At the same time, the U.S. is engaged in Lebanon in July of 1958. Something happens in Iraq, which has grave long-term consequences. Iraq was a kingdom led by King Faisal, and a group of army officers led by a general named Abdel Karim Qasim overthrew Faisal. Okay? Eisenhower actually uses Iraq and Lebanon. He says, look what's happened in Iraq. He calls the general who leads this coup in Iraq, Karim Qasim, he calls him a communist and a Nasserite. And he says, look what they've just done in Iraq. We better go into Lebanon to make sure the same thing doesn't happen there. All right? So clearly the U.S. is deeply involved in the Middle East in the 1950s. So this kind of whole, why do they hate us, all of a sudden in 2001 really ignores, several generations of history. Right? I mean, how many of you knew beforehand that the U.S. had sent troops into Lebanon in 1958? It's not common knowledge, right? A couple people, right? So the United States is still able to use its influence, its sway there, and ultimately, gets a government change in Lebanon. all right? So the U.S. doesn't deal with Middle Eastern realities. It doesn't accept the power of Middle Eastern or Arab nationalism. It continues to put everything in the context of the Cold War. Why? Because that's really all it's got. Unless it can raise this specter of communism in the Middle East, it cannot act in that region. It cannot credibly go in there and do what it does, because the U.S. claims to be an advocate for self-determination and for sovereignty and for democracy. And so if a country like Egypt or Syria or Lebanon says this is the kind of government we want, the U.S. doesn't like it, it has to find some kind of other basis for going in and changing that situation. And it becomes communism. And even when it goes after Nasserism, it does so within the context that Nasserism is the same as communism, right? Okay? So this is a major problem. Arab nationalism doesn't just suddenly emerge because, some crazy mujahideen in the 1990s, got pissed off at the U.S. and started blowing up buildings, right? This is a long-running global, contextual issue that becomes more and more violent as decades go by and doesn't justify blowing up buildings. But at the same time, one has to understand why there's such a positive response among so many people when that does happen. See, I think what's important isn't why necessarily, Osama bin Laden or whoever does what he does. It's why so many people support that. Why in so many pockets of the world, not just in the Middle East but elsewhere, people say, hey, that happens every day elsewhere. The U.S. got a taste of its own medicine. I was talking to a Korean scholar a few years back who said that in Seoul, Korea, which, it's an American ally, they get tons of money from the U.S., on September 11th, there were cheers when the towers went down. Like you had it coming kind of stuff. That's not justified, that's not legitimate, but at the same time, one has to understand how historically this environment was created. And the 50s are really important in that regard. The attack on Nasser, really was really bitter, really hard to swallow. And a lot of Arab nationalists, a lot of political people never got over that. And today, it's still a very powerful image. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to push the button?
There's not.
Oh, okay.
I'll try to go back. Did you say that the U.S. understood that they couldn't say nationalism, or do you think that they didn't understand that you can't treat this as communism?
That's a good question. Yeah.
For the American people.
That's a good question as to whether, they legitimately knew that it wasn't communist, but they were using that. I think, for the most part, I think they understood that these were not communist states and they weren't about to become that. Well, to some extent, yeah. I think they understand that, the best way to legitimate, to justify what you're doing is to say you're going after communism. That still is incredibly powerful. Communism, in certain areas may have some allure, but in general, most people are anti-communist. Right? And the image of Eastern Europe is very powerful. Communism in Eastern Europe, everybody condemns that. So yeah, it's still, you can get a far more positive response by attacking communism than anything else. At the same time, I think they understood that Arab nationalism was a plan. It scared the hell out of them. They knew it was different than communism. What's that? Did they know anything about it? Some did, some didn't. There were clearly people in the region who understood what was going on. Just as, think of the China hands who were telling, Truman, look, Mao Zedong's more popular. You may not like it, but it's true. So there are plenty of people on the ground saying, yeah, Nasser represents the will of the people here. You may not like it, but it's true. I actually think nationalism scared them a lot more than communism did. Because it's legitimate. Communism, in a sense, in Eastern Europe, communism was imposed. The Red Army stayed there and forced these governments to be that way. But these states like Nasser, or in Syria, or Iraq, Karim Qassim, these are essentially, homegrown, right? And so I think that the forces of nationalism scare the hell out of the U.S. because, what are they doing? They are doing in a sense the same thing communists do, which is saying we want control over our own resources. We want the Suez Canal. We want all these UFCO lands. We want our own oil in Iran. We want all the resources in Indonesia. That kind of thing. Or in Vietnam, it's not really even about resources, it's about political independence. We want to be our own country, damn it. We've defeated the Japanese, we've defeated the French, we've defeated the Americans, we want to be our own country. So, Tom Patterson, who's a really good historian, says that they ignored realities and went after communist ghosts. And that's a nice way of putting it, because in essence, that's really the best they could come up with.
They didn't even bother to like try to learn anything about it or understand it either. It almost sounds
Well, yeah, I think in a sense there's a willful, and again, Vietnam is the thing I know best. And in 1960, there were, a dozen Americans who could read or speak Vietnamese at any level whatsoever. There really was no conception, and, James will talk about this, to really understand, Vietnamese culture, Buddhist culture, that kind of thing. Sure. Well, who was one of after the U.S. pacified Iraq last year? Who did the Defense Department send there? Franklin Graham. Anybody know who Franklin Graham is? You don't know who his father is. Franklin Graham's father is Billy Graham. So what do you think Franklin Graham does? He's a preacher boy. And what did Franklin Graham bring to Iraq with him? He brought Bibles, right? All right. You can kind of see this might be a bit indelicate. You've invaded a country, with Sunni and Shia Muslims, Kurds in the north, and you bring them Bibles. So.
it is to understand what you're doing and going anyway.
Yeah, but so on one hand, I think it's too easy to say, oh, they were clueless, they didn't have an understand, because I think there was always information available. There were tons of people who understood. They have power, yeah. So why? In a sense, the better question is why not? Why would they care, right? The assumption there is that they're so big and so powerful they can get their way, and they generally do. In Lebanon they did, and in Guatemala and Iran, and even Nasser. Really. Went to great lengths. He outlawed the Communist Party. He jailed communist leaders. When he forms the United Arab Republic with Syria, they outlaw the Communist Party. So, which is no threat to anybody. And in a sense, why not? From Nasser's point of view, it's like, these guys aren't important enough. Why should I let their presence hang me up? So, it's really vital. And I think, communism is not an issue any longer, but the kind of whole Arab terrorist, kind of ideology is kind of replacing that now. And so, like last night on this TV show, the guy's saying, well, they've captured 189 people. That justifies the Patriot Act, right? That assumes so much. Would they have captured these people without the Patriot Act? On the other hand, they didn't kind of get the message when people were asking to learn how to fly airplanes but not take off or land. So I guess we shouldn't assume anything, right? I don't know. In Washington, the differences between nationalism and neutralism and communism really didn't mean anything to Dulles, Eisenhower, to the establishment there. Meanwhile, anti-Americanism in the Middle East was already well established. There's a great document I just found a few weeks ago. It was written on May 1st, 1950 by Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State. He was actually passing it along. And the title of the document was Anti-Americanism in the Middle East. And in it, you could have written that document 4 weeks ago. Recent bombings in, fill in the blank. Anti-American demonstrations in, fill in the blank. Continued attacks on our support of Israel against the Palestinians. And it has this laundry list, and it says, continue to lead the Arab world to look at us with disdain and suspicion. This is in May 1950. The exact same document could have written by Colin Powell last week, if Bush would allow him, I guess. You'd have to see if Bush will say it's okay, or Condoleezza Rice or somebody. You could have written the same thing, right? This is nothing new, and it's really vital, I think, to understand that. This is not just, this actually transcends, what's historically important. This is, if you're going to be an engaged citizen, you should really know a little bit about this. If you're going to have a bunch of wars in this region, and if governments in that region are, allegedly or really going to be sponsoring people who come here to try to blow buildings up, you ought to know a little bit about it. It's really easy to just kind of paint these kind of, Hollywood images of goofy people with rags on their head, blowing buildings up and talking funny, the kind of whole Schwarzenegger thing of it. But there's a lot more to it.
I noticed this kind of digressing a little bit.
Push the button.
Have you seen commercials for that new show, The Grid, and how I was just wondering how, what hand, if any, big business has in that, and
Actually,
kind of transferring our ideals and preconceived notions that we have already of the Middle East.
the grid's funny because before the movies at the theater, they have the little, you've probably all seen it. Have you seen that? Where they talk about the grid, and they have about a 10-minute segment on it. And in fact, the people from the grid went to the White House for aid. And what's funny is that this one guy says, and some of those guys are really excited by the ideas we gave them. So, right after 9/11, Bush sent people to talk to Hollywood writers saying, if you were a terrorist, what would you do next? Because these guys in Hollywood write, these fantasy things about it. But I digress. But the point is, no, but in a sense, pop culture is important in that regard, right? There's also a commercial now to join up in the Army for Special Forces, and it shows basically Taliban, they're in Afghanistan, and the guys with the what are they called? I've gone blank. The burqas on, right? And it's so that's a really powerful imagery. Arab terrorists, right? You can get away with a lot, that way. Yeah.
To what extent does the the present Arab I guess I'm going to call them terrorists, but Muslim Arab terrorists, to what extent does that have roots in the Nasser nationalist movement? Is that still the same kind of goal, or?
No, there weren't any, that kind of activity didn't take place in the 50s and 60s. You didn't have people hijacking airplanes and blowing up buildings or that kind of thing. Well, I think there's a continuum. At the same time, Nasser was secular. That's important. Most of these were secular movements. I think that the idea that people in the Middle East hate the United States is clearly relevant. If Dean Acheson can write a memo on May 1st, 1950, titled "Anti-Americanism in the Arab World," then that says something. I don't even have to say it. Dean Acheson said it, right? Yeah, so there's clearly, something going on now. It may be, actually, it's not for different reasons. The thing is, if you look at, and it's not just this one memo, but if you look at pretty much the NSC in 1953 or 54 had a position paper on the Middle East where it talked about the perils involved in our continued support of Israel against Palestinian rights. That's a common theme. The U.S. supports Israel in the Middle East, and there's a risk involved there. So, jump ahead. Al-Qaeda is dramatically different. Dramatically different. Al-Qaeda would have hated Nasser, just like they hated Saddam Hussein. These are secular states. So, clearly there's a vast difference there between, Muslim-based terrorist groups and Nasserism. But at the same time, the analysis is really similar, which is why, I always say, it's not important why Saddam or what's his name, bin Laden blew up the buildings. And I think it's fair to assume he did. He gave three reasons, right? The bases in Saudi and the continued sanctions against Iraq and support of Israel against the Palestinians. I really don't think Osama bin Laden cares about that. He didn't care about Palestine. He hates Arafat and he hates Saddam. What's important is that millions of people, not just in the Arab world, but elsewhere, believed him and felt the same way. Right? They were outraged for the very same reasons that he stated. And that does have long-term historical roots, which really need to be understood. It's really easy to, let's go in there, they're terrorists, they're trying to do this and that. But, that's a real facile way. And if you have overwhelming power, you can get away with it. You don't have to know more about that, But that's not the case. Well, I think there is a strong level of anti-Americanism. I don't know. I haven't followed it. I don't know how sincere the kind of whole religious ideology is. My point isn't that he didn't do it for those reasons. Although, it's clear he's hated Saddam Hussein for forever, and he doesn't like Arafat because they're secular. Those are secular political leaders. But the point is, to me, what's more important is not that he did it, because you could say, oh, that's just 20 crazy people who committed suicide, right? The point is that there are others quite willing, and we see this today, every day in Iraq, to do the same thing. Why is that? These are not Al-Qaeda in Iraq, despite all the rhetoric. There's not a single shred of proof that these are Al-Qaeda or even Muslim fundamentalists, right? Why are they doing that? You know, why are bases being blown up in Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, I think that's crucial, and that does, yeah, clearly have. I mean, the analysis, if you listen to this, it does sound very much like what Nasserites were saying in the 1950s. So, in that regard, yeah, I think it's really important. That's why I'm spending so much time on it. I mean, I think there are some things you want to fly through, and some things you're quite willing to kill a whole class on, and this is one of them, because it's important. I mean, it really is.
Can I ask?
Yeah, of course.
All right. So, if there's no, I mean, ideologically, there's no connection between Nasser and the modern day movement there, then what would you say is the connecting point of the?
Well,
is it just the ideology that they hate America, or?
well, no, I think. In terms of Islam, I don't think there's much of a connection. But ideologically, I think the whole concept of sovereignty is really important, and both of them say that. I mean, that's really clear if you look at the Arab nationalists in the 50s and 60s, and today these guys. I mean, they're talking about sovereignty. We want Americans out, and that's not really. I mean, it's anti-Americanism to the extent we don't like what you've done. You overthrew Mossadegh, and you didn't give Nasser money for Aswan, or you continue to support Israel. But more than that, it's sovereignty. We want to control our own resource, our land, our political system, right? So, I mean, in that regard, yeah, I think there is kind of an ideological continuum. I mean, I can have a very positive view of Nasser and find Osama bin Laden reprehensible, and I do, in fact, but that doesn't mean that they don't share some common analysis. Yeah.
So then how did it work so well in Latin America, according to the United States anyway, in terms of making Latin America its protectorate, but it broke down in the Middle East basically as it started?
Well, I don't know if it worked that well in Latin America. I mean, we haven't gotten to Cuba yet, have we? I mean, yeah. Well, it's a lot easier to. I get your point, and I'm not really being facetious, but I get your point. Latin America. I mean, the U.S. has a much longer history of control there. It's able to use its military aid as a way of maintaining the fealty of these states. It can train Latin American military leaders at the School of the Americas. American business has a far deeper tradition and far more political influence there. And that doesn't mean that anti-American, a Yankee go home, is very common in Latin America. The U.S. has been able to keep a lid on that much better, although, it didn't do it in Cuba for sure, and in Nicaragua. Just 25 years ago, a few days, they celebrated their 25th anniversary. So there's anti-Americanism there. The Middle East, it's just much more difficult to have that kind of control over. The legacy isn't as great. I mean, those were British and French colonies, and they have oil, they have resources. But the U.S. has done a pretty good job there. I mean, when you think about it, this is the first time American troops have actually been engaged there, and it's 2004. They may have sent some troops in 1958 or whatever, but they've done a pretty good job working with the Saudis and Saddam Hussein and the Shah of Iran and groups like that. So I'm not sure the difference is that great, although there clearly is. Were you going to say
I
something?
was just going to say on this issue of the importance of these ideas and why it's fairly easy to recruit people who are willing to engage in terrorist activities. I think and undergirding all this too, I think there are basic issues of class and poverty and education. There are just lack of opportunities, and it just, among Palestinians and people from Iraq now, there's a considerable level of poverty and misery. This creates a pool from which to draw upon.
And that goes to the question of modernization. But that never took place. It never happened. I mean, modernization didn't. And Egypt, it probably did better than most, which is why I think Egypt's standard of living is probably.
Continuum that gets us back into,
Yeah.
questions. Historical underpinning of all this is class and poverty.
Oh, sure. I mean, most of these, Iran, I know a little bit about. I mean, and that's a good case study in modernization, because after the Shah takes over, after Mossadegh is overthrown, the Americans come in with all these plans for rural electrification and irrigation and kind of in a modern society, the kind of things that we wouldn't even think about. We take it for granted. You're born with it. I'm not talking about strip malls and Starbucks, but just basic stuff, plumbing and water, medicine, things like that, which didn't exist. And so David Lilienthal, the guy who created TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, comes in, he has a consultancy, and he goes into Iran, and he wants to create these modern states. And it doesn't get anywhere. It doesn't. Because that kind of modernization is really empowering. It really is. People, once they have access to those things, kind of expect more. And there's a public role to play, which excludes a private role. And so, as I said before, if you look at the figures on arms sales, this is where it comes in, right? So, so fast forward to the 1990s. I mean, Palestine is a great example of this. In Palestine today, 80% of the population has grown up in a refugee camp. They don't have homes because they've been bulldozed, all right? Sure, that's fodder. Right? I mean, if you're recruiting for an anti-American group, Jesus, that's not hard to do. It's not. So, and in that regard, and these are the same kind of dynamics, although, what you saw in the 50s was this kind of air of modernization, and now you don't really see that. I think, well, were you going to follow up on that, or then?
This may be all wet historically, but it seems to me that the big fear among dictators is to have a fat, swollen middle class full of expectations.
Yeah.
Then you've got to actually answer to the...
I mean, these are essentially feudal states run by families. And the last thing they want is any kind of empowerment outside of the family structure, which is why, I mean, America's best ally has always been Saudi Arabia. They let American bases in. I mean, if you look at, but and what is the rest of the Arab world? What do these people think of the Saudis? They're blowing up Saudi Arabia. Riyadh is getting hit probably more frequently than anywhere else, right? So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind too. And we kind of tend to say, why do they hate us? Well, it's more than that. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia is a great example of that. Kuwait, which was always considered kind of, a client state of the U.S. So, I mean, the whole, I mean, it really does get back to the failure of modernization in a lot of ways. The failure to really address the political conditions in those societies, the inequalities and everything else. And that's what Nasser was talking about. It scared the hell out of everybody. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, based on her question, wouldn't it be also a difference between South America? Because South America has a lot of poor people and all that. I mean, wouldn't it also be that the Middle East is Arab nationalist?
Oh, yeah.
It's a whole different religious system over there.
There are clearly, I mean, major cultural and I mean, for instance, missionaries have always had a vital role in containing Latin America, right? You can do that a lot easier. You can do that a lot easier in Latin America. Yeah, well, I mean, you can send a Mormon on mission for 2 years in Guatemala. You're not going to do that in, Kuwait or wherever, right? Yeah, I mean, they're clearly. Oh yeah. I mean, it's easier. There's no doubt it's easier to kind of keep a lid on Latin America. That doesn't. I mean, don't think that they can do that. I mean, it blows too. It blows over. I mean, we'll talk about that. I don't know if we'll get to it today, but in Cuba, it blows over repeatedly. Or in Nicaragua, I mean, that's what Che was trying to do, right? He was trying to create an insurgency throughout all of Latin America. I mean, it's not hard to go somewhere, ply somebody with a drink or two and get them to start talking about what they really feel about the United States. One of my friends is Puerto Rican, very well off, nice upper middle class Puerto Rican. And he used to tell the story. There's a very popular song there where a guy sits down and he starts talking about how much he loves the United States. But then after a couple drinks, he's talking about how he hates them because of Vieques, because of this and that and everything else. And he says it's really popular throughout Latin America, that whole idea that, No. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, Ho Chi Minh never hijacked a plane and blew up a building. Right.
It's probably, you're right, we touched on with religion, it's probably a religious thing. We can't.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it, and I'm reluctant to say something because I'll probably say something really insulting and stupid and offensive, and I do enough of that, every day. So I don't understand Islam well enough. I would recommend you all take classes from Dina Al-Sawal if you can. She teaches courses in Islam. I don't know it that well. I mean, it's it's hard to believe that, on the other hand, look at how many Christian fundamentalists commit acts of violence. How many doctors who perform abortions have been murdered. How many women's health clinics have been blown up. Actually, the numbers are far, far, far greater than anything Al-Qaeda has ever done, if you look at it in straight numbers. Or look at, what's his name? McVeigh, right? I mean, McVeigh was a Christian militia guy, right? So, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm reluctant to do that because it's really easy to say Muslims are crazy and they blow things up, which is kind of the Hollywood version of it. And, I mean, I find fundamentalism, violent fundamentalism is repugnant, but I don't know. I don't know.
That's also what makes it easier to sell a war over there, too, I think. To make people believe that they're crazy and they'll do anything.
Oh, sure. And, I think everybody plays that. I mean, I think there's a great scene in the movie Reds, which is about the Russian Revolution, an American who was there, John Reed. And Reed is speaking, and actually during one of the speeches, he's there with the Comintern, and he's in the Middle East. And he calls for communist revolution. But then you hear the translator use the word jihad, and the crowd goes nuts. And Reed says, wow, why are they responding that way? He says, because you've just called for a holy war against the infidels. And Reed is furious. He hasn't called for a holy war against, he's called for a communist revolution. And I think the point is that, in every state, in every culture, there are certain things you can do that'll be more effective, right? I mean, you've all heard the song Onward Christian Soldiers, right? I mean, that ain't, I don't think Carlos Delgado would stand up for that either. So anyway, any other questions? We have a few more. All right, get going, then we'll take a break. Arab nationalism is clearly troubling to the Americans, and it's a difficult issue. It's in American education, I think it's a real shortcoming that we don't talk more about this, and especially nowadays. I don't know, maybe with I don't go around to political science courses and whatnot, so maybe there is a better kind of contextualization of this whole thing. But in general, it's generally not there. One of the big kicks I get out of teaching is every year I go to Dina's class. I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years now, and I do a lecture on the U.S. and the Middle East, and I remember the first time I did it, it was really amazing because no one had known any of this stuff, and it really was eye-opening. Not to suggest that because I'm not an expert, this isn't the stuff I do, but at the same time, it's really striking on how little we know about that. And I, conspiratorial enough to think that's not a coincidence. I mean, I think there's a specific reason that none of this really gets out. If you read, just read the kind of op-ed things, that you get on it. I mean, it's not really contextualized at all. If you read stuff coming out of the British paper, Robert Fisk, who's just incredible. Is he with the Independent or the Guardian? He's with the Independent, right? Georges Monbiot, who's also with the British paper. And these guys will do this. I mean, their columns about the Middle East are littered with references to back in the day, such as in 1958, or the Curzon Line, or the Balfour Declaration, all that kind of stuff. You don't see that here in the U.S. You don't really see that. I mean, that 1950 document that I came across, I'd never seen it before. I mean, it wasn't hidden or anything, and I found it fairly easily, but at the same time, I wasn't aware of it. And to me, that's really critical when in May of 1950, the Secretary of State can say, they hate us. They're blowing up our buildings. There are demonstrations in the streets. They don't like what we're doing in Palestine. I mean, this is really telling, and there's a bunch of stuff like that coming out. So this is really an issue that has incredible validity, not just historically, but in a very real way today. Coupled with that, the other major issue in the 50s as well as today was Israel and the conditions of Palestinian refugees. That haunts America's Middle Eastern policy. It draws the Americans more deeply and more dangerously into the region's affairs. It is a cause for American intervention on several counts. It is a cause for the United States going to the highest nuclear alert in 1973. And it is, I think, despite what everyone is ignoring, a major cause of what the U.S. has been doing in the region in the past few years. So you can't talk about the Middle East without talking about Israel quite a bit. Israel and oil. You talk about Israel, you talk about oil. There are a lot of different ways to do this. The outline says Israel, America's cop on the Middle Eastern beat. And this is actually an idea I take from Noam Chomsky. Whenever you're stealing ideas, you should steal from the best. So I steal from Chomsky. Among people who study this, there's quite a debate on why the U.S. supports Israel, and we'll do the history of it. Why the U.S. supports Israel so heavily, and I mean that's irrefutable. The U.S. supports Israel. They give them $14 million a day, by far the biggest recipient of American support. And one of the key questions is why. And a lot of people say it's because the pro-Israel lobbies, the so-called Jewish lobbies in the U.S. have so much power. I mean, Israel in large measure was recognized in 1948 because Harry Truman, a Democrat, wanted Jewish votes. He was quite candid about that. Truman was an interesting character. On one hand, he wanted Jewish votes and pandered. On the other hand, he could be quite a racist. He once said that he thought the Ku Klux Klan was actually started by Jews because who else could get a $2 piece of muslin and sell it for 18 bucks? Okay, this is the president. So there's this long-standing idea that the power of American Jews who vote Democrat, who give money to Democratic candidates, makes it impossible to criticize Israel. Okay. That's one line of thought. It's very powerful on the left, the kind of idea that supporting Israel is a test, kind of like being anti-communist in American politics. If you criticize Israel, your political career is basically, damaged or ruined. A woman from Georgia, Cynthia McKinney, was defeated in an election just a couple years ago after she came out very critically about Israel. So we'll take a break now.